My name is Vivian Wong, and I'm going to be talking today about how developing nations have just as much obligation to combat climate change as the developed nations have. So in the Kyoto Protocol, which kind of sparked this whole debate, it was signed in 1992, and it exempt developing countries from the obligation of combating climate change. But this idea of pinning the responsibility on only developed countries is wrong and not helpful. First off, developing countries actually have the biggest incentive to reduce emissions. Developing countries are expected to be the countries which will suffer the worst effects of climate change. Comparatively, more developing countries are, rather than developed countries, are outside temperature zones. So it will be hit harder by rising temperatures and changes in precipitation patterns. Therefore, they have the greatest responsibility to change. Developing countries are suffering with increasing problems as a result of climate change, such as crop failure and the spread of deserts. These issues are exacerbated by high rates of population growth, meaning that more people need to be catered for on a shrinking resource base. Unfortunately, it is the case that countries that are less affected by climate change itself, who have the wealth to prevent the problems it causes, are not going to take the lead in reducing emissions because they have no or less incentive to do so. Especially in democracies where you see politicians who have to respond to the wishes of their electorate. And the electorate's priority is most likely not going to be the people who are thousands of miles away and they will probably never meet. As it is, developing countries who are in harm's way of climate change, it is the responsibility of their politicians to act to prevent climate change, or at least reduce its impact. The WHO, the World Health Organization, held a meeting summer of 2015 where they concluded that it's a pretty shocking statistic that they said that air pollution is the cause of death for 1/8 of deaths around the globe annually. This is mainly due to the fact that air pollution leads to life-threatening diseases or health problems that often result in death, unfortunately, and especially we see this in third world countries. Latest studies by the WHO and other international agencies show that apart from development of respiratory diseases, exposure to air pollution also could lead to severe risk of cardiovascular diseases such as strokes and ischemic heart disease. Moreover, stronger links of air pollution and cancer have also been established in recent studies. Around 88% of premature deaths due to air pollution exposure occurred in low and middle income countries, and the greatest number in the Western Pacific and Southeast Asian regions. India and China are two of the world's biggest sources of pollution. So don't you agree that at least for the sake of their own citizens, they should make attempts to go green? And as I was saying about India's pollution, I just wanted to take a look at the shocking statistics we have. Most of these cities, these three here, and the 4 on top, are all Indian cities, major cities. And we have the highly populated city of Delhi at the top with a shocking amount of 153 micrograms per cubic meter of air pollution. Whereas places in the US, like California and this one town in Pennsylvania here in Ohio, we see the numbers are extremely lower. They're in the teens. And these are in big cities, highly populated cities. So you can see the huge contrast between those countries and our country. During the 68th World Health Assembly, they called for all countries to develop their air quality monitoring systems and health registries update to improve surveillance of all illnesses related to air pollution. Because as we all can see, pollution has become such an out of control and lethal problem in the world. If all countries promoted things like clean cooking, heating and lighting technologies and fuels, and strengthened international transfer of expertise, technologies, and scientific data in the field of air pollution, our children would be able to live in a safer and healthier environment. Experts say that policies and investments supporting cleaner transport, energy-efficient housing, power generation, industry and better municipal waste management would reduce key sources of urban outdoor air pollution. And actually, contradicting what most people would think, developing countries are just as capable as the developed nations of committing themselves to help combat climate change. By taking on such a disproportionate amount of obligation, developed nations intrinsically claim that developing ones are not capable of finding solutions themselves. This is demeaning to developing countries because it assumes that the developing world lacks the creativity, the money, and the innovation to lead the way on solving climate change. This approach is unlikely to motivate developing nations to do their own research into cutting emissions. This will lead to less emission cuts all over the world, as developing nations see that they are not considered capable or needed to contribute. For example, China is currently the world's second largest economy with a GDP of 9.24 trillion USD. But yet it's still considered to be a developing nation. Meanwhile, developed countries like Japan have a GDP of only 5 trillion USD, and Russia has a GDP of 2 trillion USD. With a rising population of 1.4 billion people and being one of the world's largest contributors of factory pollution and air pollution, why shouldn't China share obligation to help the environment? Also, the idea of pinning responsibility on one country, like I said, is wrong in general, and it will not help the global situation at all. This very slow progress being made by the international community in its conferences to come up with some sort of framework to prevent climate change shows that relying on the nation state, either developed or developing, is not the way forward. Instead, individual action could actually be a method of changing the environment over time. So we can see these third world countries or these developing nations improve their own environment only by their governments encouraging them to make it possible, to choose a low carbon lifestyle, and if necessary, penalizing the highest emitters. So yes, developing nations are capable of combating climate change just as much as the developed nations are. According to Joan Rhetoric, former UK energy and climate change minister, over 40% of the UK's CO2 emissions were a result of personal choice. So therefore we see a huge potential for individual change and how it can change the outcome of the environment for the future. We are already seeing that individual action can happen and can work. There are many ways in which individuals in third world countries or developing nations, they could do a little to prevent climate change on their own. They can also do things such as carbon offsetting, which is a good example of this. Individuals can choose to offset their emissions, either all of their emissions or emissions from individual activities, such as flying, by paying for projects that reduce emissions elsewhere, which usually means either funding renewable energy or even a simple thing such as tree planting. And also, like I said, little changes in the household and day-to-day activities. Overall, the issue of climate change is on a global scale. Therefore, everyone around the globe should be contributing to save our planet. And before I finish up this slide, I want to go back and show these statistics of China. The numbers are pretty similar to India's. They're shocking in the hundreds. Here you see all the Chinese major cities where the factory production is mainly done. And I just want you to take a good look at how different it is from the US. And you can just think about, if a country is capable of doing all of this damage to the planet, why are we looking at them as incapable? And why are we the ones taking on all that responsibility? So I'm just going to finish up my topic by saying that the world today is globalized and interlinked. It is not economically viable to expect developed nations to use more of their resources to combat global warming. The global economy depends on wealthy, developed countries because it is them who will create, the global economy depends on wealthy, developed countries because it feels as though the developed nations are not capable. But like I already have proven, they are. So thank you for your consideration on this important global matter.